Why has more blood been spilled over this tiny sliver of land than almost anywhere else on earth? The answer is not in modern politics, but in ancient scripture. The Bible reveals that this land is God's prophetic clock. Its borders were drawn by God, its ownership was given by divine covenant, and its ultimate fate is tied directly to the return of the Messiah. To understand this land is to understand the future. The story of this land begins not with a war, but with a promise made to one man, Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls him to leave his home and go to a land that he would show him. In Genesis 15, God formalizes this promise in a sacred covenant ceremony, declaring, "To your descendants I give this land." And the borders he draws are immense, far larger than modern-day Israel, stretching from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, and encompassing the lands of 10 ancient peoples, including the Hittites, Amorites, and Canaanites. But what makes this land grant so unique is the type of covenant God made. In the ancient world, there were two types of covenant. A conditional covenant is like a contract. If you do this, then I will do that. Its fulfillment depends on both parties. But the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. We see this in the strange and solemn ceremony described in Genesis 15. When the covenant was sealed, only a representation of God himself, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch, passed between the pieces of the sacrificed animals. Abraham did not. This symbolized that the fulfillment of this promise rested entirely on God's own faithfulness and character, not on the future obedience or disobedience of Abraham's descendants. This is the foundational secret to understanding the promised land. The ownership was not a temporary reward for good behavior. It was an eternal and unconditional divine decree, sealed by God alone. This is why, despite centuries of exile and unbelief, the land remains central to Israel's destiny.
The covenant made with Abraham was passed down through a specific, chosen line. This was powerfully tested and confirmed with his son Isaac. In Genesis 22, God gave Abraham an unimaginable command. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him on a mountain in the region of Moriah." This command seemed to contradict the very promise of the covenant. Yet, in a radical act of faith, Abraham obeyed. At the last possible moment, the angel of the Lord stopped him, and God powerfully reaffirmed the covenant, promising to multiply his descendants because he had not withheld his only son. Prophetically, Mount Moriah is the very location where the temple would one day be built in Jerusalem. The covenant was then passed to one of Isaac's sons. His wife, Rebekah, gave birth to twins, Esau and Jacob, and God had already declared that the older will serve the younger. The transfer of the birthright began not with deception, but with disdain. Esau, a man driven by momentary passions, came in from the field starving, and for a single bowl of lentil stew he sold his sacred birthright to his younger brother. The book of Hebrews says that Esau despised his birthright, showing he had no regard for the spiritual inheritance that was his. Later, through a famous and controversial story of deception, Jacob secured the firstborn blessing from his blind father, Isaac. But the covenant was not ultimately passed down through human trickery. It was confirmed directly by God himself. When Jacob fled from his brother's anger, he had a powerful dream of a stairway to heaven. In that dream, God spoke to him, saying, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying." The divine deed to the land was now formally and supernaturally transferred. It was an exclusive inheritance, passed from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob, the man whose name God would later change to Israel.
For 400 years, the descendants of Jacob multiplied in Egypt, growing from a single family into a great people, just as God had promised. But they became slaves, suffering under the harsh rule of Pharaoh. It was then that God raised up a deliverer, Moses, to lead them out of bondage and into their inheritance. After receiving God's law at Mount Sinai, they arrived at the border of the Promised Land. But here the nation's faith faltered. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan. 10 of them came back with a report of fear, speaking of giants and fortified cities, saying, "We can't attack those people, they are stronger than we are." This evil report caused the entire nation to rebel against God, refusing to enter the land he had promised them. For this act of unbelief, God's judgment was swift. That entire generation was sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every one of them had died. Only their children, led by a new leader, Joshua, would be allowed to enter. The conquest of Canaan, therefore, was not just a military campaign. It was a lesson in faith. It was a new generation trusting God to do what their fathers believed was impossible. At the Battle of Jericho, the walls of a fortified city crumbled at the sound of trumpets. Later, when 5 Amorite kings united against Israel, God himself fought for them, hurling down great hailstones from the sky that killed more of the enemy than the swords of Israel. It was during this battle that Joshua uttered his famous command, praying for the sun and moon to stand still to give them more daylight to complete the victory. And the Bible records that the sun stood still and the moon stopped. There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to a human voice. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. After centuries of waiting, the nation finally took possession of the land that was central to their divine destiny.
After the conquest, Israel entered a chaotic period under a series of judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But God's plan required a unified kingdom, and he raised up Israel's greatest king, a man after his own heart, King David. It was David who conquered the ancient Jebusite stronghold of Jerusalem, also called Zion, and established it as the political capital of the united nation. But David's vision was grander. He made Jerusalem the spiritual capital as well, by bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence on earth, into the city with great celebration. David longed to build a permanent house for God, but God, speaking through the prophet Nathan, reversed the promise. God told David that instead of David building him a house, God would build a house, a dynasty, for David. This is the Davidic covenant. God promised, "I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom." He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This was a promise ultimately fulfilled in the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the Son of David, whose kingdom will have no end. As promised, David's son Solomon built the magnificent first temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, the very location of Abraham's test. The scale was breathtaking. It took 7 years and tens of thousands of laborers. The finest cedars of Lebanon were imported for its structure. The Bible tells us that the entire interior of the temple, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the altar, was overlaid with pure gold. When the temple was completed and the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the most holy place, Solomon dedicated it with a powerful prayer. As he finished, the Bible says that fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The divine presence was so thick and visible that the priests could not even enter to perform their duties. God had officially placed his name and his presence in Jerusalem, sealing its destiny as the most sacred and contested city on the planet.
With the temple built, Israel reached its golden age. But God had given the nation more than just a land grant. At Mount Sinai, he had given them his law. While the promise of the land itself was unconditional, their ability to remain in the land and enjoy its blessings was entirely conditional on their obedience to God's covenant. In the book of Deuteronomy, God set before them a blessing and a curse. The blessings for obedience were a portrait of total shalom. God promised, "You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land. The Lord will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you." He promised prosperity, health, and security. But the warnings for disobedience were equally specific and far more terrifying. They were a perfect reversal of the blessings. "You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies." God warned of disease, drought, and famine, saying, "The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you, iron." The ultimate curse for turning to idols was exile. Moses prophesied, "The Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other." But even in this warning, God promised a final restoration. He declared in Deuteronomy 30 that if his people returned to him, he would bring them back from captivity to the very land of their ancestors. The entire cycle of Israel's destiny, possession, disobedience, exile, and final restoration, was laid out before them. They ever took a single step into the land.
So the Bible laid out the entire cycle of Israel's destiny with their land, and history has followed that script with terrifying precision. The prophecies of exile were fulfilled. First, the northern kingdom was scattered by Assyria, and later the southern kingdom of Judah was exiled by Babylon. After the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish people were scattered to the four corners of the earth for nearly 2,000 years, just as Deuteronomy foretold. But the prophecies of restoration were just as certain. In the 20th century, the world witnessed a miracle. Against all historical odds, the Jewish people began to return to their ancestral homeland from every nation they had been scattered to.
The re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was not just a political event, it was a stunning fulfillment of the regathering that God had promised through Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. Ezekiel 36 even prophesied that the desolate land itself would come back to life when the people returned, that the ruins would be rebuilt and the land would be cultivated and become like the Garden of Eden. Today, Israel is a world leader in agricultural technology, literally making the desert bloom. This brings us to the heart of the modern conflict. The intensity of the struggle over this land is because it is the stage for God's unfolding prophetic plan. It is a clash between God's absolute faithfulness to his unconditional land covenant with Abraham's descendants and the complex historical reality of other peoples living in that same territory. The land is central to Israel's destiny because God swore it to them, and their miraculous return to it is the single greatest sign that we are living in a unique and prophetically charged era. The people have returned to the land, just as God promised. But the prophecies did not end there. The return to the land is what makes the final prophecies possible, the building of a third temple, the confirmation of a final covenant, and the great war for Jerusalem. The prophetic clock is ticking, and its hands are pointing to Zion.
This briefing is now complete, but the investigation never ends. To ensure you receive all future declassifications, be sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Like this video to signal its importance, and share it with others who are ready to look beyond the headlines. Leave your own intel in the comments below, because there is still much more to declassify.